I'm Jacqueline Maley, and you're listening to Inside Politics from the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. This week we have our very special guest star and favourite of the podcast, Shane Wright, Chief Economics Correspondent, joining me from Canberra. Hello, Shane.
Hello, and I think it's about time we had the Melrose Place music playing as I come on.
Every time we make that reference, we age ourselves because, you know, we're both Generation X. So Melrose Place was like, it looms large in our consciousness, but not for anyone younger than...
Don't go there. Just don't go there with any definitive figure in that space.
No, anyway, we are here to talk about figures. Thank you for that segue, because it's been a bit of an emotional rollercoaster this week for mortgagees. As you know, I am one of those, so I take these matters very seriously. On Tuesday, the Reserve Bank Governor, Michele Bullock, gave a speech where she said that inflation was too high. The bank was going to do whatever it took to get inflation back into the acceptable target range of 2 to 3%. She said that putting off mortgage rate hikes would only lead to more pain down the track. There's no point delaying, ripping off the Band-Aid. Higher unemployment and higher inflation would only ensue. So on Tuesday, she was talking tough and things were looking grim. I was quaking in my boots. But then on Wednesday, the clouds parted a little bit. What happened on Wednesday, Shane?
Well, your boots got cheaper.
Literally, they did.
The price of footwear actually fell, according to the ABS.
I don't know. Not at the places I'm buying it, but carry on.
This says more about where you buy rather than anything else, but also that you're a woman of high taste. The inflation figures that we got for June from the ABS on Wednesday morning were very interesting in the fact that they really showed, particularly at the headline level, we'll get to the underlying level in a second, but headline, that inflation is much lower than what the bank feared, what Treasury feared, and what a lot of analysts had feared. Like it came in, it dropped from 4 to 3.8%. To put it in perspective, the RBA had in early May said we get to June, inflation will be running at 4.8%. Federal Treasury thought it could even be 5%.
Yeah, which is terribly high.
That is a big miss. And remember, they made that calculation knowing that the federal government's cut in excise and the little slice that's been taken off because of GST, that had been fully factored into what had happened. So inflation, the big headline number was lower. Petrol is lower, but there are other things that are falling, aka the new pair of boots that you've been eyeing off have got cheaper. Men's clothing has got cheaper. I know you love I know you love scrambled eggs for breakfast in the morning. The price of eggs had come down. Veggies had come down. Even if you want to have a tipple at the end of the day, wine had got cheaper through the last month.
And furniture, household appliances, lamb's been very expensive for a long time.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, the biggest price rises were in building and construction, which is bad news for anyone who hopes that the housing pressures will ease further. And also electricity prices, which is confusing because we keep hearing from the national regulator that wholesale prices are actually going down and they're being cut.
That's right. And you'll actually see electricity prices fall in the next month. So this is, just think of it, you've got, think of inflation as one big pie divvied up into 12 pieces, one for each month. The July slice from last year will come out in the next measure. That July slice last year includes a 30% increase in electricity prices in Sydney and Canberra and a big one in Melbourne, which was all to do with the end of subsidies that the states and the feds had put in place. So there's going to be an uplift from petrol prices, but the electricity prices are finally going to get back to something that is measurable and understandable fairly soon. Even in the housing construction stuff, which is a really big part of the CPI picture, the pace at which that inflation in that area had been going up is actually subsiding a little bit. Some of it's due to perhaps oil not being quite as expensive, but I think the federal budget is actually taking a bit of demand out of that sector, which that's not the normal way that federal budgets, a lot of macroeconomists think federal budgets should work. You should be taking money out. They don't often have a hit to confidence, which stops consumer spending, which has an deflationary effect. That might be what we're seeing play out at the moment.
Yeah, I want to get onto that in a minute and ask you more about that. But in terms of the political effects of this sort of ease off of inflation, inflation is the most pernicious kind of really economic force in terms of people's living standards and the way people feel, I think, within an economy. And also politically, it just makes us so angry at the government when we feel like our living standards are going backwards. And it's in our faces all the time because we're going to the petrol bowser or we're going to the supermarket. We're like, wow, things are so expensive and my wages aren't keeping up. Inflation's now fallen for 3 consecutive months and the One Nation vote has sort of flattened over the last few months. Is this causation or correlation, Shane Wright?
It may be too early to say causation, but there's definitely a correlation going on. And I think, and you can see that around the world, where you have high inflation, populists on the left or the right always do well. And I don't think I'm getting too far out of the political mainstream and saying One Nation is a right-wing populist force, and they have really been buoyed by what's going on in terms of cost of living. And you can see the way, say, Pauline Hanson talks about it. She understands that quite well in terms of trying to say, we will do something to make cost of living more affordable. And you're exactly right in terms of, say, the price of oil and petrol, that is always in people's faces. And so people feel it's always a discussion point, even in the workplace. How much did you pay for petrol? One thing, there's not as many people using petrol. Like we can see, the use of unleaded is falling really quickly.
Is that because of the introduction of EVs into the market? Right.
EVs
That's really
you can start to see the impact of them, and the fact that I was actually looking at some data out of the industry department just this week, where the amount of unleaded petrol being used has fallen by about 30-40% over the last 15 years, and it's really falling quickly.
Michele Bullock, the RBA governor, did allude to that she talked about that on Tuesday because she said that basically the economy is much more resilient to oil shocks than it used to be because we're not as dependent on oil as we were, say, in the 1970s. There is a but, though. I want to ask about petrol prices because the halving of the fuel excise that the government announced back in April and then extended for a month very benevolently, that's finally ending this Sunday, I believe. So aren't we going to see petrol prices just shoot back up again and then fuel inflation, pun intended?
Yes, I love a good pun. Love a good pun. And you're right. You will see petrol push up towards $2 a litre again. But remember, was it the second or third week of March, it was $2.50 a litre. So these are huge swings. What that does to people and their spending patterns, and it'll come back to what else is going on through the economy right at the moment, will be really interesting in terms of the overall, and this gets to the underlying inflation story, which is where the Reserve Bank's really focused, because the underlying inflation measure, which strips out the price of oil, because it tries to lop out the big things, the things that go up the most and the things that fall the most. And believe me, there are prices that do fall. They lop them out. And that was actually a bit lower than what the Reserve Bank had been anticipating as well. And that's why there's been this big change in what people's expectations are around where interest rates are going to go through this year and into next.
Okay. You talked about the budget before and the measures that were taken by the government. They copped a lot of bad publicity after that budget in May. A lot of people, particularly investors, business people, were criticising the taxation measures, mostly the capital gains tax changes. I wonder, did all of that negative media coverage actually impact demand and people's feeling about the economy more generally, do you think, and maybe lead to this result, which is taking a bit of demand out of the economy because people are scared or cautious or anxious?
All three. But I think you're right. I think you could mount that argument, and we saw it in, say, the consumer confidence measures, which really nosedived very quickly after the budget. Even though, and that has rebuilt because ultimately people have worked out, hold on, I'm not a property investor. I'm not negatively gearing a property, and I'm not a high-tech startup entrepreneur. Like they are, that Venn diagram is a pretty small Venn diagram of people. But there has definitely been that hit to confidence, which I think is what's feeding into it. Like there is, like even on Thursday, NAB announced that they'd seen a fairly sizable fall in the number of people wanting housing loans. I will guarantee you now that they are from investors, which was which is ultimately the government's whole aim. The government has not been shy saying, look, we don't want as many investors buying existing homes. We want first home buyers to be doing that.
Yeah.
So you look at that, you look at what's been going on in terms of house values. The property market it was already, Sydney and Melbourne, even well before the budget came out, with the 3 interest rate rises, which they haven't fully flowed through the economy yet. Sydney and Melbourne were going backwards. It now looks like Perth, Adelaide, Hobart, Canberra have joined them. And this goes to an issue called the wealth effect, which Michele Bullock touched upon this week, saying, well, if the housing market is slowing rather quickly, consumers don't feel as confident. They don't use their homes as a bank card. They don't need to go buy new furniture. What was one of the things prices fell in the last month? The price of furniture. Household textiles and household appliances, other things that you need to buy if you wanted to buy a new home or you're updating a home, they also fell. So I think that's telling you something about the broader impact of the budget, what it's done to confidence, and feeding into inflation.
They're all sort of highly discretionary spends, I suppose. Everybody's sitting on old couches quite happily, including myself. Michele Bullock did mention low productivity growth as a major problem in our economy. This is increasingly a sort of political issue. She said that productivity growth was the only way to lift living standards. And I was reading about this week, productivity in this country has barely grown since 2016, which is 10 years. You'll compliment me on my maths there. What can the government do to lift productivity? Because this is such a handbrake on economic growth, isn't it? And we're not going to sort of see a lift in living standards and better ourselves and better our children's lives until the government gets its act together on this.
Well, I'm going to push back and say it's not the government's job around productivity. And around the world, people, especially in this country, what will the government do for X, Y, Z? The history of productivity is technology. Now, we actually, from the Industrial Revolution on to the advent of refrigeration-powered flight, the government didn't have a role in those sorts of things. It was new. They were new ideas, and we're actually seeing new ideas, aka artificial intelligence. The country that's at the epicenter of AI right at the moment is the only country where productivity growth has lifted, and that's the United States.
So is there nothing the government can do? I mean, can it not sort of boost investment in technology or, back certain technologies that are going to improve productivity? I mean, the government subsidises all kinds of industries. Why can't it back ones that improve productivity?
And there was a $10 billion productivity package in the budget, which most people have missed. A lot of that was to do with red tape, which, that is one thing you can do. But there was some really good research out about a month ago from E61, which actually went to your very question. And they were saying, well, managers in this country probably aren't as good as those in the United States or elsewhere. And this is where This is the deployment of knowledge, which is ultimately that's how you improve the operation of a business. They become more productive. And they actually gave very good examples of American firms that might set up shop here in Australia, they face the same IR laws, the same planning laws, the same workforce laws as their Australian-based competitors, but they outperform them on productivity.
They're better at it.
They're better at it. They gave a good example, say Costco versus Woolworths and Coles, and Aldi's also in that space as well. They are from outside, but they have different managerial operations and systems.
What about AI then? Because we are seeing data centres being built in Australia. Is that the solution here, that we just need data centres? We need to become fully sort of adoptive of AI technology, and then our productivity might boost itself just like the United States is?
Look, this is like if we're we moved back. You and I loved the 1980s. The music was better. We went back to the 1980s.
I was a child in the 1980s, so I was a baby. But anyway, yes.
Oh, come on. You go back to the 1980s and say, right, Australia, look, these things called personal computers, no, we won't use them. I'm going to stick with my typewriter. Imagine where Australia would be if the nation's companies said no to new technology. And it's not just the technology itself, it's the use of it.
But is that what Australian companies are doing? Because we're always hearing the narrative that Australians are early adopters of technology. We love our technology.
Like how in the 1980s we're the fastest adopters of VHS. We were.
But what about now?
yeah.
I mean, what about the adoption of AI? And can we see how quickly that's being rolled out across the economy?
Look, that's why I'm not going to be overly critical of Australian business because this is relatively new. The US is really at the leading edge. Like companies like Commonwealth Bank, Qantas, they are using AI in really interesting ways to try and boost their productivity levels. And that is actually what you want to see. Building the data centres is one thing, but it's using the power of AI that those data centres enable. That's where we actually need the business sector to lift its game and their workers. Even in a workforce, people using AI in different ways and then passing that information around. That's why, like, we're almost into the whole argument about work from home. If people aren't in the room with other people, you can't bounce. It's harder to bounce ideas off each other. That's why there are a lot of businesses say, I want my staff in the business because they're better bouncing ideas off. That generates ideas, generates productivity.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, the way that I use AI in my work now, which is never to craft copy, I make that very, very clear. None of us use it for that. But we use it for research and for transcription and all sorts of things. And I've learned all of that from being with my very clever colleagues. Shane, we've got to leave it there. I do thank technology because technology means that I get to talk to you in Canberra and here I am in Sydney, and yet we get to connect via the power of the internet.
Thank goodness for the internet. So many good things. And so you and I can go on YouTube and watch 80s and 90s TV shows, even better.
Actually, I'm taking my daughter through 80s and 90s movies now, so we're about to do Back to the Future, and we just do Karate Kid, which really holds up.
My wife is rewatching Charmed at the moment. If you're into, you'd be a Charmed fan.
Yeah, I loved Charmed. It was great. It was really great TV. All right, Shane, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Good to see you again.
Okay, we're going to segue now to sunny Melbourne, where there's been plenty of political action this week. Joining us from The Age, we have Chip Legrand, Victorian State Political Editor, who is a first, I think, on our podcast, so welcome.
Thank you. How are you?
Good. It's such a pleasure to have you, and you've been so busy. Listeners will no doubt know by now that Victorians have a new Premier, Ben Carroll. I just want to ask you a few questions about the federal implications of the Victorian leadership change, because Ben Carroll, when he gave his first speech as newly anointed Premier, he very much framed his takeover of the leadership as essential to guard against what he said was the risk of a coalition One Nation government being formed at the next Victorian election, which is in November. What do you make of that justification from Ben Carroll?
So where Victoria's sitting right now is we are the first state where One Nation is coming for a Labor government. So in the federal sphere particularly, and in South Australian election, we saw what happens to the coalition when One Nation gets a surge of support. And obviously that's been a very destructive impact on the federal coalition in terms of their polling numbers. And we saw what happened to the number of Liberal MPs who were wiped out of the South Australian Parliament because of the support for One Nation. So here what's happening is that even though, yes, One Nation has also damaged the coalition and is a threat to the coalition, particularly in regional seats, and the National Party is really feeling the brunt of that here, as you know, they are elsewhere. One Nation is eating into Labor support in traditional Labor seats in the outer suburbs of Melbourne's west and north. Now, these are seats that even if you had a surge of support for the coalition for a change of government, the Liberal Party doesn't win those seats. One Nation could. And so this is a different level of threat to the Labor Party, and it's that, and it's really the culmination of that pressure and the likelihood that they're going to lose the election that led to the change of leadership.
Okay, so is it possible to say then on what basis people would change their vote from Labor to One Nation? Because as you say, the eating into the coalition support from One Nation has been, I suppose you could say, around conservative issues, right-wing populist kind of issues, some economic narrative, some culture war issues, but mostly as well that the coalition has completely sort of collapsed as a party. What kind of a person is moving from a Labor vote to a One Nation vote in Victoria in those outer urban seats that you're talking about, and what issues are they moving on?
Well, the classic case is someone who works in whether it's a working class profession or a lower wage profession. Life's difficult. You're living in suburbs that are poorly, relative to the more established eastern suburbs, poorly serviced by public transport, by schools, by other services. So these are people who have lived for the past 12 years under a Labor government. And indeed, don't forget, in Victoria, we've only had 4 years this century where there hasn't been a Labor government, and they feel they're not being looked after. And so these are areas where that are growing really quickly. So you've got a mix of new migrants, new arrivals, but also people that feel like the population growth is faster than the government's capacity to keep up and to provide them what they need. So there's that real sense of resentment and a sense that you're being let down by the Labor government.
Yeah, okay. So you might be a traditional Labor voter, but Labor is basically taking you for granted, and you're under a lot of pressure, and you don't see anyone who at a political level who's looking to credibly ease that pressure. So you may as well sort of chuck a vote One Nation's way because they're making some big promises.
Yeah, you're really looking to kind of to blow up the system and force them to start again and start thinking about you in a different way.
Okay. So we're talking about voting intention based on polls, because when it comes to reality, One Nation doesn't actually have much of a presence in Victoria, does it? I think you said yesterday when we were talking that they have 2 candidates in the whole of the state of Victoria and they don't have an official leader. So if you're going to vote One Nation at the next Victorian election, it's going to be a zombie vote, isn't it?
We've got one upper house MP who was there since the previous election, who got in on a very small vote. We've got one other declared candidate who ran in the Nepean by-election and did quite well, pushed the Libs quite hard there. But yes, beyond that, Pauline Hanson hasn't said who her leader is going to be here. Rob Harris reported this week that they're expected to announce a bunch of their upper house MPs on Friday. Maybe the lower house MPs will follow. So this is a deliberate strategy by One Nation. We're going to have like a candidate dump on a Friday, which will make it very hard for anyone to go around and scrutinise who's who in the zoo as far as the One Nation candidates. But until this point, we don't really have any Victorian policies other than a promise to scrap the treaty that the government reached with First Nations people. There's no Victorian specific policies that One Nation's talking about. It's very much a hand-me-down grab bag of their policies that Pauline Hanson talks on any given day about in Canberra.
Yeah. So if they don't have enough, particularly lower house candidates to field, enough seats in the lower house in Victoria, aren't those votes just going to flow back to the coalition and they could end up benefiting Jess Wilson, the Liberal opposition leader?
They've said they're going to stand in most seats. Or if not in all seats. I think they might have promised to stand in all seats. So, look, if it's not all, it'll be close to. And, there are a lot of seats where One Nation's going to have a serious impact. I mean, the contest that we're heading into in November is going to be a genuine 3-way contest. Whatever the merits of One Nation's policies and their political organisation, all the polls suggest we're headed for a genuine 3-way contest. And that's going to play out in so many different ways depending on where you are. So, for the Liberal Party, they think they're in a good position because so long as they can finish second in seats, then they can win those seats either on One Nation preferences or on the preference of Labor voters who, under no circumstances, are going to want to preference One Nation. But it's going to be such a complicated election, like the old pendulums that we used to refer to, and you look at your half dozen or your 8 marginal seats that are the ones in play in a traditional red-blue contest. That's not really what this election is about. There's going to be, red on orange contest, blue on orange, blue on green, teal on blue. It's a bit of a kaleidoscope of colours, really.
It's going to be exciting and very interesting. Victorians are obviously very fed up with the close and the potentially corrupt relationship between the Labor machine and the CFMEU, which has sewn up various big construction projects in your state, costs the taxpayer many, many billions of dollars, and normalised a lot of very thuggish and criminal conduct on building sites there. I wonder, what's your opinion, Chip, on how that taint spreads to federal Labor and to the Prime Minister himself? Or did he inoculate himself when he put the CFMEU into administration and he kicked John Setka, the former head of the CFMEU, out of the Labor Party?
Yeah, obviously it's not limited to Victoria, because we can see what's going on with Queensland and the inquiry up there into the CFMEU, but there is something particular, and particularly Victorian, about this political nexus that developed between the CFMEU, who was run by completely odious people, and particularly the previous administration of Daniel Andrews. Daniel Andrews as Premier, drew a lot of factional support from that part of the left faction, and really the rise of the CFMEU here coincided with a realignment of the sort of the factional tectonic plates under Andrews, where the right was diminished, the left expanded, almost developed a political monopoly, and that flowed through to the kind of leverage then that the CFMEU had in terms of ensuring which government sites they got to control.
And do you think it's bad for the entire Labor brand, like federally as well, or has Anthony Albanese sort of done enough to separate himself? He's obviously not from Victoria, and he did take a stand against John Setka in particular only after his thuggish and criminal behaviour was sort of, reported on extensively by Nick McKenzie and others from our stable.
I'd be surprised if this taint spreads to Anthony Albanese, mainly because one of the big differences in state and federal governments is state governments have to deliver projects like rail tunnels and road tunnels and big infrastructure projects in a way that the federal government doesn't really have to do. So they don't get their hands dirty in the same way. I think where probably the similarities for Anthony Albanese, or the concern, if he was looking on in terms of what's happened in Victoria, is that having a political dominance over a party by a particular faction, the left being in sort of uber control of the Labor Party, and one person in the case of, say, going back to Daniel Andrews, having so much personal control over the affairs of the party, in the way that we saw on display with Anthony Albanese at the National Conference last week. That's not healthy. And it can come unstuck really quickly. It's the speed of which things have happened here, I think, that's taken a lot of people by surprise. And now you have Ben Carroll, who's from the right faction, and he is busy dismantling some of the key things that happened under the nearly 12 years of his predecessors. So I think the lesson is that the Labor Party is a much healthier place when the party is balanced in terms of the competing interests of the different factions, and when you don't have too much power concentrated in the hands of any particular individual.
Let that be a lesson to Anthony Albanese. Chip, thank you so much for coming on, and we might have you back at least in November, if not before, because as you say, it's going to be a fascinating election, and it's such a test case for the electoral support of One Nation in real time on the ground. So we'll definitely be seeking your insights again, and we thank you so much for coming on and making time.
Thanks, Jax. Pleasure.
You can read all of our political news on our website theage.com.au or smh.com.au. Today's episode was produced by Chi Wong with help from Debbie Harrington. Our executive producer is Tammy Mills, and our podcasts are overseen by Lisa Muxworthy and Tom McKendrick. Before you go, follow Inside Politics and leave a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm Jacqueline Maley. Thank you for listening.